Okay, welcome back to the Zenith Poker podcast. Today we've got Alex. Alex is one of the moderators in the Zenith Poker Discord. So Alex, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I'm a poker player based in Melbourne, Australia. I've been playing poker to some extent for the past, I'd say, 8 years or so. Although it was mostly live. I was playing and it was never full time. And it's only been in the past couple of years where I've really started to properly play online more, and really started to actually work on my game since I ended up finding Zenith. And again, yeah, I've only ever really been playing part time. I've always either been working or studying alongside poker.
Okay, so you've been playing poker part time. How long have you been playing for, and how did you start?
Yeah. So in terms of like playing for more than say like a $20 buy-in, I've been playing since would have been for about 8 years now. Yeah, basically, I first got into like poker as a game just because my dad played poker. He played Manila actually. Like it's an Italian variant of it, which is it's a limit version with a short deck, and it's basically just wait for the nuts. Um, but yeah, and he introduced me to that when I was like 12 or something. And then in high school, towards the end of high school, ended up playing like micro stakes, hold'em with some of my high school friends, and that was like $5 to $20 buy-ins. And then after finishing high school, a couple of those guys took me to the local casino, and that's where I kind of got introduced to live. Because there's a funny story around there. So I was when you're like just when you've just turned 18 and you're going to play for like almost 10 times the stakes you've usually played, because I was going to be playing 1-2. And you're playing, just such high stakes, like, you're terrified. And so I figured, okay, I'm going to give myself the best chance possible and make sure that first night I went, it was on Chinese New Year, because what I figured was, okay, there's going to be, a bunch of people there celebrating Chinese New Year. They're going to be, just ready to gamble it up, money on the table. And then when I went there at my table, people were spewing money. There was a Russian guy who was buying in black chips and putting them in blind every hand. And the thing that really stood out to me was that even though I tried to go there for Chinese New Year, I don't think there was a single person of Chinese descent there. No one at the table was there for Chinese New Year, and that made me realize, okay, if the regular people are like this, like if the game's like this all the time, this could be viable. And so that's how I got started.
Okay, so you started off, playing live when you were, what was it, 18, 19?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about your journeys as a live player?
Yeah, so as a live player, it was again just something that I did, partly for just because I enjoyed it, partly because it was decent money, because I was still studying at the time, and I didn't have I suppose a conventional job at the time, so I figured, okay, this is a decent way to make some money on the side, because at the time I was still living with my parents, so my living expenses were low, which meant that I was just able to just play poker when I could, build up a bankroll on the side. And in terms of, I suppose, working on my game there, I started off with YouTube videos. From it was guys that you just came up with Preflop charts based off their own experience. Obviously, Sims weren't a thing back then. I think there was a YouTube channel, Grips, I think, was one of the ones that I used. And I did a lot of posting on 2+2 at the time as well. It was like that feedback from people on hands was probably one of the biggest ways that I developed over the years. And honestly, that's still something that I'm doing today. Just it's mostly on like the Zenith Discord rather than on 2+2 these days. And yeah, there was a pretty similar process along all those lines, basically up until about 3 years ago or so, at which point one of the regs at local casino just happened to mention Zenith to me. He recommended it to me, and Yeah, and that's what got me introduced to the world of solvers and sims. And from that point, yeah, my game just really took off at that point where I actually started, having theory behind it rather than going off kind of intuition based off an insufficient sample size.
Oh yeah, great. And what were you studying?
Yeah, so my undergrad was aerospace engineering. I graduated in 2016 or 17. Yeah, and then I was working in the automotive industry for a couple of years. Then I left that. I left that to do my master's, and I'm currently in the final year of that.
So you're
Yeah,
so
it's the
you're
master's
so you're you're doing your masters
in analytics.
in
So
analytics.
yeah. So obviously a lot of statistical things. And there's actually been some units that are specifically going into the theory of simulations, which is obviously very relevant to this. And honestly, I probably learned more for that unit from Zenith content than I did from the actual unit, just because there's a lot of the inner workings of solvers, which really helped me understand that theory, which was a good intersection and very means that there's a lot of overlap between my studies and poker as well.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And so you're currently doing your masters and you're also playing part time as well.
Yeah,
Or
so
what are you
I'm
doing?
only so I'm studying for my masters, but it's a course that's designed for people who are basically working alongside it anyway. Even though it's technically a full-time course, I think the earliest start for any of the units was like 4:30 p.m. So it's basically designed for people who are working, a regular job to be doing alongside it. And I do actually also have a regular part-time job as a data analyst. But again, but that's also part time, and so that means that on the days that I'm not working, I can generally, put in some volume. I probably don't put in as much poker volume as the full time pros. Like I generally average around 20K hands a month at the moment, which is a lot less than if it was full time, but it's decent on the side.
So let me get this straight. You're studying full time, you're working a part time job, and you're playing poker part time. And
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you
So yeah.
still manage to just destroy people online. Can you tell me about how you're doing online?
Yeah, so online at the moment, I'm currently mostly playing 1K KNL on Ignition. Being in Australia, the options of sites to play on are rather limited compared to other places, such as the US, Canada, New Zealand, Europe. And so, however, fortunately, the games on Ignition are quite good. That if anyone's been on the Discord, you'll see me every now and then just posting ridiculous hands from playing there. And in terms of my progression on Ignition, I started playing on there a couple of years ago at 25 NL. I think I deposited like $500 worth of Bitcoin on there to start. And with some initial run good, as well as a decent amount of study, I was just able to build up my bankroll from there.
So have you ever rebought on Ignition?
No, I haven't, fortunately.
So you started off with $500,
Yeah.
and you run it up to how much?
It's just under six figures, I think, because
Right.
I've done some withdrawals as well, so I'm
So
not sure of the
you've
exact
been
amount. Yeah,
withdrawing. You've been withdrawing.
yeah.
So how about you describe for the listeners this graph that I've got up here, that you recently posted into the Zenith Discord. Is this all on Ignition? So you got
Yeah,
200,000 hands here.
yeah, that's 100% Ignition. Yeah,
This is 100% Ignition.
yeah. Sorry, I can't see the screen. Is there?
No, that's okay. I'll try and describe it for the listeners. So Alex here has played 200,000 hands on Ignition. And how long did this take to grind out this 200,000 hands for you? Because you say you're
Yeah,
playing
yeah. So
20,000 a
it's a
month.
Yeah, so so my volume did vary a bit over the early months. Like I'm just loading up the graph on my end as well, so that way I can see. Yeah, so initially I wasn't putting in a huge amount of volume. I was putting in maybe 5 to 10K hands a month initially, and then it's only basically since the start of this year that I've really ramped up the volume to about 20K hands a month. So if you look, in the basically from September 2019 up to the end of 2020, I played maybe 100,000 hands, and or less than 100,000 hands, and then this year I've played, the bulk of those hands you see in the graph.
So this last 100,000 hands that you played was all this year,
Yeah,
and
and that was
last
all at
year.
either 500 NL or 1K NL. Yeah.
So you're telling me within 6 months or so, you've gone from whatever you were playing, whatever level you were playing before, to just destroying it at 1K NL.
So when I look at, I suppose, the breakdown in terms of the actual times, I was in terms of the times I played the hands. So looking back at it, I was playing a few thousand hands per month up until September 2020. And then in September 2020, I played less than 1,000 hands. October 2020, I played 0 hands. And November 2020, I played again less than 1,000 hands. And during that time period, it was basically pure study of sims. It was just like a lot of playing against the solver in GTO Plus. It was a lot of looking through the preflop charts. I'm not sure if the dynamic viewer, I'm not sure if I'd made that yet. It might have been an Excel-based viewer I was using at the time. And also a lot of just contributing to discussions on Discord as well. Yeah, like the combination of those is what really allowed me to elevate my game a lot, and I think that's what's really allowed me to take off this year.
Right. So this last 100,000 hands, like you can see, compared to the previous 100,000, like your red line just shoots way up. Do you attribute that to anything in particular?
Yeah, so I'd say that a lot of that red line shooting up is really getting away from a lot of standard lines that are very value oriented, because I feel like conventional wisdom out there is that the bulk of your money is going to come from people calling too often, and people, and just being able to extract value against fish. And one of the offshoots of that as well is the overuse of just default small bets. It's almost kind of a meme on the Zenith Discord at the moment, to like range bet a third pot. And doing that strategy is probably going to help your blue line in a lot of areas, because there's a lot of people that just way overcall against that. But when you start, ramping up your sizes, people really start overfolding, and a lot of those sizes, are preferred by the solver. So when you start taking people out of their comfort zone and they don't realize, that they might need to defend a bit wider than they're comfortable with, your red line really starts to shoot up, because everyone's studied, defending appropriately against a 1/3 C bet, but not many people, know what to do when they get like potted into as a C bet.
So a lot of this has come with your solver study this
Yeah,
year,
yeah.
and you did sort of 3 months of study towards the end of last year, and you've come out of it, and you're just like redlining the shit out of people. And
Yeah, exactly.
in terms of like BB per 100, what's your BB per 100 right now?
So it's at about 9 BB per 100. And if I just even filter for 1K NL, let me just filter for that over here. Yeah, even at 1K NL, I'm still at about 7.5 bigs per 100.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
just insane. And you're doing this part time, and you're making, what a lot of people would see as the equivalent of a decent full-time income.
Yeah, so yeah, I suppose I'm very fortunate in that regard to be able to do this, just because I have the time, I had the resources in terms of being able to make those initial investments into purchasing access to a lot of the Zenith sims, in terms of having a decent enough computer to run a lot of my own sims initially. Although these days I wouldn't consider the sims I ran to be of a great standard. and also just having the time in terms of being able to take time off from things, and the fact that my job and my studies do happen to be flexible enough to allow me to play poker in between.
Is there anything specifically that you would attribute to your success? Like here you look at your dollar win rate, and it's $40 per 100 hands. And if anyone knows anything about online poker or has played online poker before, often people play above 250 hands per hour. So that would mean you're making $100 per hour when you're sitting at the table online. Is there anything in particular that you would attribute to that success, or any tips that you want to give to people who might have been in your position a few years ago? If you could go back and just like give your previous self some advice, what would that be?
I'd say don't be afraid to take breaks from the game, because a lot of this really came down to those 3 months in which I basically stopped playing. I think a lot of people just really focus too much on trying to build a bankroll on a site by just grinding out at the micros, which for getting experience, it's fine. But you really shouldn't focus on beating the micros if that's what you're doing. It's really about, don't be afraid to just take a lot of time off, delve into the sims, play against trainers, because you're going to get a lot more for your game out of playing against the trainer than you are out of playing at the micros. Because if you have people opening 4x and cold calls all over the place that you aren't going to see as often at higher stakes, you're not really going to be learning anywhere near as much, especially because even if you are playing against decent players online, most of the spots you're in are trivial. Like you can't really drill into spots by actually playing. You've got to go into the lab, so to speak.
So taking time away from the game to study, is that one of the important things that you would take away from this?
Yeah, I'd say that's the biggest tip. Like don't be afraid to just take a few months off and just work on your game, and also don't be afraid to, I suppose, to skip the micros if you have cash flow from another source, and if you're not in a country where playing the micros is enough to make a living, then you're going to be better off building a bankroll by working just a regular like minimum wage job than you are by trying to grind out a bankroll at the micros.
Yeah.
Your hours just going to be a lot better, and you can spend those hours you've saved actually studying instead of just trying to play at the micros.
Yeah. A lot of people who grind the micros just grind themselves down rather than end up spinning their wheels and end up being stuck there for a while. Alex, you're obviously a very successful bloke, both academically and career wise and poker wise. Is there any like general life advice you want to give to people? I know you're probably on the younger side. How old are you now?
So I'm 27 at the moment, which in the poker, at least from when I was playing live poker, I was basically always the youngest. But then from talking to the people on Zenith Discord, it seems like I'm one of the oldest here now, which is a very weird feeling.
Yeah. I mean, poker players often, and especially online poker players, end up being on the younger side. Is there any sort of just general life advice you want to give to people who are younger than you? You're talking 18 to 21 kind of age.
Yeah, so I mean, this might be not advice that a lot of people in the poker world generally agree with, but I would say that you really want to diversify your potential future options. Like, I wouldn't focus on poker being your one thing going forwards, just as I wouldn't focus on having a single like career path as a thing going forward. Like, you shouldn't focus on, yes, I want to be like let's say an engineer in this industry. And you shouldn't focus on saying, yes, I want to be a poker player. You should try and keep as many options open as possible with your resources. Like, I've been keeping poker open as an option, but then I've also been diversifying by getting my Masters of Analytics. And one of the reasons I chose that specific course is because it's one that can be used in any industry. Like, my future isn't tied to whether or not, people are still making cars in Australia, for example. And, in my previous job where I was in the automotive industry, whilst I was there, they shipped half my department off to the US. And you just because of that much volatility in all the areas of your life, you can't really just put all your eggs in one basket. Like, even when it comes to poker, that you could have some government regulations come in, at some time in the next few years that really, hamper your ability to make money there. It might, hamper the ability for you to get the money into your accounts or to spend it. Like, you've just got to keep your options open so that a single, I suppose, event or change in policy in the future doesn't destroy all your options.
Yeah, great. And so there's a fair amount of overlap with sort of what you're doing in poker and your degree. And I'm sure you've thought about this a lot. Are there any like sort of degree pathways, tertiary education sort of things that you might recommend to people who are also interested in poker and studying from solvers?
Yeah, so the academic field that relates to the use of solvers in I suppose, a more commercial context is what's called operations research. A lot of it basically tells you the theory behind, solvers. It will teach you how to construct, a basic solver, and it will teach you how to use solvers and apply them to regular aspects of your life, and also, in a broader business sense. And that allows you to really, use the solver skills that you've picked up from poker and take it to basically any industry. Because once you learn the field of operations research, you begin to realize that there's basically no industry that couldn't benefit from it. And in fact, like, even at my current job, which is in the manufacturing field, one of the reasons that I got the job in the first place was because I told them of my use of solvers in poker. Obviously, not every employer will be as understanding of that, but enough of them will be that you should be able to leverage your solver use in poker into a real world benefit in terms of employability, or even if you want to do freelance stuff, because it's definitely the sort of thing you can also do freelance as a consulting role for a lot of companies too.
So analytics and operations research.
Yeah, operations research is the key one.
What sort of do you have some like more specific examples of what kinds of career pathways that leads to?
Sure. So one of the big fields so logistics is a really big one. So anyone who's planning, so any business that has to plan, truck routes and the like. So obviously Amazon uses it, and any of the smaller couriers. And any business that needs to move stuff from A to B, basically, they need a lot of people in operations research, because they can just save so much by, they can cut down the number of trucks, the number of man hours, all that stuff, just by shifting things around a bit better. Also, you can look at it into different resource allocation things. So any company that has a lot of employees, they're going to have to assign them somehow. And they'll need operations research people to give them, a broad sense as to how to most efficiently do that.
Right, and what's the sort of demand for people who know about operations research, who have a degree in operations research, and can use analytical skills and solver skills in business?
Yeah, so there's a huge demand for people who have analytical skills. Like the amount of jobs out there that are looking just for like Masters of Analytics, or experience in some of the software packages that you'll learn in the course of doing a Masters of Analytics is huge. Like, there's no shortage of jobs out there in that field. In terms of operations research specifically, there are still jobs there. However, it's the sort of industry that is still growing. In that a lot of these companies, they are still relying on conventional wisdom in terms of, they have some guy that's been in the industry for 20, 30 years, and he has a rough idea as to how to assign those things, and he's generally able to get the job done reasonably well. But as those businesses scale up, or they move into newer industries, or as those people with that experience start to retire, that's where your use of operations research is really going to come in, and a lot more of those businesses are going to be looking for people with skills in operations research going into the future.
Great. Let's change the topic and move back to poker, because that's probably why a lot of people are here. Do you still play live? I know with Corona.
So I haven't played live since COVID started, basically. Because in Australia, unfortunately, we're not the most well vaccinated country in the world at the moment, and because before COVID, I was playing in a lot of live games here. I actually hadn't played at the casino even in the half year leading up to COVID, just because there was so many live games around, and the live games were so much better. Like, they had less rake, they had deeper stacks, you got some benefits from the hosts, and the players were generally worse as well. So yeah, I was mostly playing in the home game scene before COVID, and I do know that those games are still running to some extent at the moment. I keep in touch with some of the people who were involved in those games, but again, I'm not planning to play personally until I get vaccinated, which is probably not going to be till around the end of the year.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about the home game scene in Melbourne? What is that like?
Yeah, so one of the big groups who I did play with was the dealers from the local casino. So in Australia, the rules are such that if you work at the local casino, you aren't allowed to play there, and there's only one casino in the whole state over here. So what that means is that basically the only option for these guys is to play home games with each other, and they run home games with each other, and a lot of them have a lot of gamble in them. Also, I wouldn't say, that they're not exactly rich, but they make, a decent amount of money from their jobs. Like, dealers are reasonably well paid here. And so what that means is that they're able to play, reasonable stakes. Like, there was, you see games where even if it's 1-3, it's generally going to be, 500 to 1K buy-in, or 2-5 with a 1K plus buy-in. And there's lots of rebuys flowing as well. So that's one of the big groups. And then the other big group of home games is generally going to involve a lot of small business owners, because these guys really like to get their gamble on. I think a lot of them view it as a way to kind of, I suppose, to express their dominance over other people, or at least their perceived dominance. And that makes for very profitable games, especially since they are generally going to have a decent amount of money coming in from their businesses. And those games are all over the place. And you generally find them by going to the local casino. And there's going to be people who mention those games. Some people might recruit at the casino. And yeah, once you get into the scene, there's always going to be someone at a home game who'll hook you up with another home game, and that way you can get a pretty good repertoire of games going.
Right. And often these home games can be far more profitable than actually playing at the casino.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, the casino, the rake is higher. There's you can buy in for less. Like I think even at 510, I think the buy-in cap was still 1K, whereas I think any 510 home game is going to have a buy-in cap of at least 2K.
Yeah. So games are deeper, games are splashier.
Yeah, and just like the players just so much more splashy, especially because at a lot of these home games, people are just really there to kind of it's a much more pleasant environment for them to play in, and a lot of the people in them are mates, and so that really incentivizes people to stay for a bit longer. Whereas at the casino, it's not a very pleasant environment. Like, a lot of people, they're kind of looking for an excuse to get out of there. Like, a lot of people aren't going to rebuy because it kind of snaps them back to reality, and they just want to get out of there as soon as they dust off the buy-in.
Do you have any specific advice for people who are playing in the home game scene, or wanting to get into home games, and the way that you should be playing or the way that you should try to have others perceive you?
Yeah. So in terms of getting into home games, being friendly with the dealers at your local casino is probably one of the best ways, because a lot of these dealers, they will probably be dealing at these home games on the side, or they'll be playing in them. And especially if they're dealing in them, they want to get players into these games. A lot of the time, they'll get a cut for getting you into a game. And so, yeah, being friends with dealers is probably the best way to get into home games. And also they won't care as much about whether or not you're a good player. If a player is trying to recruit you to a game, a lot of the time it's because they think you're a spot. Obviously, if you're in the Zenith Discord, that's probably not the case. But yeah, I'd recommend trying to get in via dealers at the local casino. In terms of, and you also mentioned how you're perceived, because obviously you don't want to be perceived as like a nit or anything, and then you just won't get invited. One of the biggest way to get invited and more importantly re-invited to home games is just show up on time, because poker players are notoriously unreliable people, and that is really bad for people running games, because it just takes a couple of people being late, and then the people that do show up on time are like, oh, I don't want to wait around for 2-3 hours for more people to show up, and then they leave, and then the game just doesn't get up. Like, if you show up on time, that's probably the biggest asset to the people who run games, and that's the main thing that will get you re-invited.
Yeah, so showing up on time, that's an interesting one. And what about the way that you would play in a home game? Is there any sort of differences between the way you might play in a home game versus the way that you play in a casino or the way that you play online?
Yeah, so I'd say that there is some weight to the idea of giving action. Generally, at least the way that I'd most approach it is, as long as you participate in, I suppose, the optional gambling. They're like, as long as you participate in straddles if the whole table's doing it, if you don't sit out of bomb pots and the like, if you don't object to the 7 deuce game or like any other sort of bounties that are in there, then that'll help your image in the eyes of other people, and it'll make you want to play with them more. Make them want to play with you more as well. Also, another thing is play quickly. Most of your decisions are trivial. Don't worry about tanking. Like, if people aren't really paying attention to your timing tells, and if you've done enough study, you can make basically any decision pretty quickly as well.
Yeah, yeah. And what about the transition from live to online, and how was that transition for you?
So for me, because I actually started playing on Ignition a bit before COVID, just to get some more practice in. And in terms of playing online, I'm not sure exactly how much of a transition it was. Like, honestly, just it's better for at least your mental state. I find, just because you can sleep more consistent hours, because live games generally run late into the night. Some of them run for more than 24 hours, and that's not good for your mind, not good for your body. Whereas online, like, transitioning to online is, in my opinion, much easier than transitioning to live, because live really requires you to make some changes to your whole lifestyle, whereas online you can be a lot more flexible. In terms of the actual play style, it honestly didn't affect me too much. I wasn't hugely focused on like live reads or live tells compared to a lot of live players. I was still just focused on just making better decisions in them. The only thing that changed a lot was my decision-making process after having delved into the solver work and theory.
Okay, can you tell us a bit about that decision-making process? How do you make decisions now compared to before you started off with solver work?
So I'd say that one of the steps that I think any poker player goes through in their development is, initially they're just looking. Initially you're just looking at like your own hand, and then you move to looking at, okay, what does your opponent have as well, and then you begin looking at what I call spots. And by spot I mean, okay, when I face a C bet here, like this is, a spot. And then you move beyond spots to, and also another thing in spots is that you could say, oh, this spot on the river, it's never bluffed. Like when the flush draw misses, like, you could say, oh, that's over bluffed. Or when the flush draw gets in, oh, that's never a bluff. And then you move beyond spots to actually properly playing, a theoretical game where you understand that, okay, you actually need to have bluffs in every spot. And that's when you get into factoring blockers into your decision-making process. It's when you factor in actually how many combos of value and bluffs you arrive at each point with. And especially as you play deeper stacked games, which you'll see live more often, the importance of balancing your range a bit more in terms of being able to shop with the nuts in a variety of lines so that your opponents can't use the spot-based approach and say, oh, in this spot, he never has the nuts.
Yeah. Is there any specific advice that you would have to people who are starting out with solvers?
Yeah, so I'd say one of the most important things is making sure you have good quality solves. And by that, I mean, does the solve cover, like a reasonable approximation of what you could possibly see in game? And by that I mean, if you have, a solve that only allows, a half pot c-bet size on the flop, but you encounter a quarter on the flop and you encounter pot on the flop, but the sim doesn't factor those in, then you're not really going to be able to learn much from there. And more importantly, it's not going to allow you to extend that to other spots. In general, the most important thing I think I've gotten out of solver study is being able to develop heuristics that you can apply to other similar spots. So just as an example, in the button versus small blind free bet config, the small blind can almost range bet like a 10 high board just because they have a ton of ace 10 off from them free betting. But then, and the fact that they have a ton of ace 10 off in their free bet range is just, it lets you realize that, okay, basically, the ace X Broadway that they have of offsuit is what allows them to range bet. And so because the ace 10 is the weakest one they have, it means they can basically range bet 10x. And you can extrapolate that to small blind versus cutoff, where all of a sudden ace jack off is the bottom of it. And so, okay, the jack high boards, they range bet. And that sort of heuristic that you can begin to apply to other spots that you might not have studied specifically really allows you to expand your game, because it means that you don't have to have looked at a sim for, low jack versus small blind beforehand to have a reasonable baseline strategy based off your studying of other spots.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people would be interested in this. How do you go about sort of using solutions to develop a heuristic and, studying a spot, studying specific solves, and then trying to apply them to other parts of the game tree?
Yeah, so I'd say one of the big things is looking at what specific ranks do, especially when you're in free bet plus pots. There's going to be specific ranks that one player is really going to have an advantage in compared to another. And what that means is that from studying basically, one of the free bet pot configs, then you can see, okay, as we change positions slightly, these ranks change, and therefore we can play, for example, the 10 high boards in the button versus small blind, very similar to the jack high boards in small blind versus cutoff. So yeah, I'd say looking at ranks is one of the best ways to develop those heuristics. And that also applies in terms of even a lot of single raised pots in the pro blinds, where you can see, okay, who has more trips. And in those pro blinds, you can see, okay, this really allows us to go for these overbet probes. And it allows you to find new overbet probe spots that you haven't seen in a sim yet.
Yeah, so the overbet probe line is a fun one in sort of the single raise pots. That's a interesting point that you bring up. Is there any specific sort of lines that you would recommend newer players to focus on compared to other sorts of lines, or should they
Yeah, I'd
just
say
study
probably,
everything?
I mean, definitely when you're studying poker as a general philosophy, a breadth first approach is best in terms of being able to have, a rough idea as to what to do when you face a variety of different configs and different boards, rather than delving into the nitty gritty of a very specific spot. Just because if you have a reasonable strategy for a huge variety of spots, you're going to just show a much greater return than a player that is a master of, say, button versus big blind single raise pots, but has no idea how to play against small blind flats.
Yeah. All right. What about what about? Do you have any recommendations for players that would interested in running their own sims?
Yeah,
Because
so
solver work is something that you've essentially specialized into now with your master of analytics. Is there anything
yeah,
specific that you would want to say to people who are thinking about running their own sims and how they should sort of approach simulating the game?
yeah. So I'd say in terms of running your own sims, even though you can technically run a solver on your computer, odds are that your computer isn't probably capable of running a sim of an appropriate quality to learn good lessons from. In general, if it's at least on current hardware, to run a decent single race pot, especially with the existing algorithms out there, you're going to need at least 128 gigs of RAM to run a single board, and most people don't have that, and that requires quite a significant investment, and that investment is generally not worth it on an individual level unless you're playing like NL 10K or higher. In general, you're much better off pooling your resources with a bunch of other people. Like, if you have some mates, if you have a Discord such as the Zenith Discord, you're much better off chipping in with a bunch of your mates to hire some hardware or to purchase a shared computer amongst all of you. And that way you can run sims that all of you use together. And it's basically the only way for it to be worth it for you to run sims, unless you want to spend a whole year of play at your regular stakes to pay off your computer, when you could just spend a fraction of that to pool sims, such as via a Zenith type group. There are some spots that you can run on your own, like some free bet pots you can run on 64 or 32 gigs of RAM, and 4-bet pots you can run on 16 in most configs. But for the really common single race pots, and even as we start to get into limped pots, you're really going to need to get some fairly high-end hardware that, is just really not practical to purchase for yourself unless you're playing really high stakes, or if you're, a poker enthusiast as opposed to a poker pro, where, you're just doing it to become good at the game and the money is kind of secondary for you.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really important point, and that really drives home what you said earlier about sort of the quality of the solves. I mean, if you want to try and fit a single race pot into a 32 gigabyte laptop, sure you can do that, but are you really going to be learning the appropriate lessons that you can from the solves that you created? You end up just sort of spinning your wheels and getting nowhere because the solve itself um, isn't isn't representative of the actual game. Um,
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and also just another thing that I see quite often from people who are first getting into solves is that probably the biggest temptation from anyone who first gets a solver is they've played a hand, they're not sure if they played it right, and they'll just plug it into a solver. They'll just basically put in the sizings that happened to be used in the exact hand. They'll put it in, and it'll say their line was okay at some frequency because they only gave it basically the sizes they used. And if those are the only options when the solver is basically going to mix between almost all of those options at some frequency because they also probably didn't run it to a very high precision. What I'd recommend is don't run a sim on a hand you've already played unless it's like a spot that you have a lot of trouble with in general. Like, don't just run a sim to see if you played a hand okay. Run a sim to expand your game instead.
Yeah, that's a really good point. A lot of players who are new to solvers just trying to find a quick answer, and often that's not possible. At least not an answer that's sort of true or close to what's actually correct.
Exactly. And I think a lot of it's also just looking for almost validation of their play. I think they just want to be able to say, oh yeah, this play was solver approved. But it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. You can have basically any play be solver approved if you put in the right inputs.
Yeah, exactly. Garbage in, garbage out is a great way to describe solvers and a lot of what people, even long-term poker players are doing. At Zenith, we're trying to put in good inputs so you actually get high quality outputs. A lot of people are going to put in just garbage, and they're going to just end up reading a garbage output while not realizing that the output is actually just nonsense. Is there any advice to people that you might have in terms of how much study you need to put into the game to sort of get to sort of the level that of success that you've achieved?
So I'd say that you want to put in enough study initially so that you feel I'd say until you feel comfortable in the majority of spots. Like, you want, if you're in the very common spots, I'd say you want to do enough study so that you're comfortable in those, like, your big blind first button, single race pots, your free bet pots involving like cutoff first button, your free bet pots involving like the first four positions basically. Your single race pots and your free bet pots, you really want to have those down, as well as probably a little bit of four bet pot study in there as well, before you even start playing. And from that point, I'd say you then begin to maybe doing some play, and as you play, you'll find spots that you're less comfortable in, and when you start encountering spots that you're less comfortable in, go back to the lab, drill those spots until you become more comfortable, and then you can really jump back in. So it's a case of, basically, if you're not comfortable in a spot that you're encountering a lot, stop playing, go back to the lab, and then go back once you feel you're ready.
What would you say the best way is to actually learn from the solver? Is it playing against the solution? Is it going through the solve and clicking through the different lines? What's the best way that you think people should approach this?
Yeah, so my personal approach is I play, so at least for postflop in GTO Plus, I'll play against the sim, and if there's a decision that I'm not entirely sure about, then I'll look in, for example, especially in terms of frequencies. Like, if I just decide to say check back a hand on the flop, and I'm like, okay, I know I check back this back sometimes, but am I checking it back too often? Then I'll go back after the hand, and look at the sim there. And similarly, if the solver told me I made a mistake, then I'll definitely be looking back at that and trying to understand why that was a mistake. And also looking at the computer's hand after each hand, seeing if the solver is making any really interesting decisions that you wouldn't expect. Then you want to go looking at the sim. So in general, I'd say play against the solver first, and then delve into interesting spots or mistakes in the sim itself after you've done that play. And in terms of preflop, honestly, a lot of it is just kind of memorizing. You can get some heuristics for yourself, especially when it comes to the free bet, four bet selection. But in terms of where you draw the line as to where a hand becomes, a call against an open, as opposed to wanting to free bet sometimes, that's just going to kind of come down to memorization, which if you use the trainer in the preflop viewer that I made, that can let you get through, like 1,000 hands an hour and really drill that into your memory.
Yeah, yeah. The trainer that you made is fantastic. And you can drill Preflop at 1,000 hands an hour, uh, which is insane compared to the amount of actual play that you would get to encounter the same number of spots. And when you tell us a little bit about the trainer and the way that you would recommend people using it.
Yeah.
The
So
Prefock
in terms
Trainer.
of so with the Prefock Trainer, there's a few features in it that allow you to really, I suppose, focus your training. Because if you're playing, 1,000 hands at micros, let's say, most of those hands are going to be trivial folds, like folding, 7 deuce off under the gun. Like you're not learning anything from that. So what you can do is tweak the range of hands you get dealt, so you can make it sure that you only get dealt the top 25%, the top 50%, top 10%, depending on what sort of spot or what sort of hands you're training with. And that way you can get a lot more out of those, 1,000 hands an hour than you would by actual play. Also, you can choose from a bunch of presets in the trainer. So if you're having a lot of trouble figuring, breaking down your free bet and call ranges from the big blind against an open, which is probably one of the toughest spots to mix appropriately, just because you're so polar and so many hands are mixing. Then what you can do is just select, okay, I only want to train big blind free bet spots. That's it. And that's one of the preset drop downs. If there are any preset drop downs that you'd like to see that don't currently exist, you can PM me on Discord, and I can look at having those added to the trainer as well. And that can also, and if there's enough demand, they'll definitely get added, because it's not too much work for me to add them. It's just a case of you guys letting me know.
Yeah. And it's the trainer is one of those things where like you made it, you kind of make it for yourself, right? It's one of those things that you would want yourself to have, and you just made it. And so like it's a tool that's made by a poker player for poker players, rather than just a tool made by a developer for the sake of profit.
Exactly. Yeah.
How
Because
how yeah, go on.
Yeah, because I was just going to say, because I, even before the Zenith viewer was there, I created my own private version just in Microsoft Excel. It read the bunker ranges, and it allowed me to visualize things in Excel rather than having to load up bunker viewer, which took an hour each time. And then I realized, okay, Excel, it technically works, but this isn't the right tool for the job. And so when I decided, okay, I'm going to make a web-based version of this, and I got help from Nick as well. Nick and I co-made the dynamic viewer you see on the Zenith site. Thomas was willing to purchase that for Zenith, and honestly, it's something that I was planning to make anyway, so it was win-win there.
Yeah, yeah. How important do you think preflop study is? Is it one of those things that people should be focusing on, or is postflop more important?
So I'd say, because literally every hand you have to play preflop, just in terms of like a range of, just in terms of sheer number of hands, preflop is going to be most important, at least in terms of quantity. And even in terms of just dollar value, yeah, preflop's by far the most important, because if you don't have appropriate preflop ranges, you just set yourself up to get owned postflop as well. Like if you end up with too much junk in your range preflop, then you just get owned by the people who do range bet every board. And if you don't, if you don't 4-bet bluff often enough, then you're just going to get owned by free bets. Like and those are big parts. Like they add up. So like preflop is essential for all the other streets, because if you don't understand your own range for arriving at a given street, you can't construct an appropriate strategy. Like if you don't know whether or not you have ace jack off in the button versus small blind free bet spot, you don't know how to play jack high boards appropriately.
Yeah, yeah, that's great advice. we're almost at time, and I know we've covered a lot of different topics. Is there any other bits of advice that you would want to give to people in Zenith, people who are coming up, people who are starting in the game and wants to do well either live or online or
Yeah,
um,
so I'd say, yeah, not just in poker, but I guess this advice is a bit more broadly applicable as well. Collaboration is your best friend. Like working with other people in terms of sharing sims, in terms of discussing hands, in terms of having people to talk to about any spots you're encountering, in terms of getting information about the general field and where to play, and everything. Like collaboration is the greatest asset um, to you and to those around you. Like being able to work together, you're stronger than the sum of your parts, basically.
yeah, great, awesome. And anyone who's listening to this podcast that's not yet in the Zenith Discord, remember to join it. There's a link on the homepage of the website. Alex, where can people find you if they have questions? What's the
Yeah.
easiest way
So
that people can get to you?
yeah, best way to find me is on the Zenith Discord. I don't have an Ask Me currently. So if you just post in general, or you can DM me if you have a more specific question. If you do DM me, and I think the answer to that question is broadly applicable to other people, I might post the answer to general, but I will keep you anonymous if you don't want it to be revealed. Yeah, I don't really have a presence on other socials, so I don't have a YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or anything like that. Yeah, Discord is the place to find me.
Yeah. And one last question. When are you going to start coaching for Zenith?
Um, uh, so if I start coaching for Zenith, it would be once I finish my course, which is going to be at the end of this year. So yeah, if you see a posting for me, it will be sometime around November, December of this year.
All right, great. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of pent up demand after this, for you to be a coach. I mean, for anyone who's listening, I offered to make Alex a coach, basically as soon as I made him a moderator, but he said no because of his studies, and I respect that. But the offer's still going to stand. So Alex, please hurry up and finish your study because people want you as their coach. All right,
Yeah, I've
thanks.
definitely gotten a lot of PMs for that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks to anyone who's listening today, and anyone who's listening to the podcast recording. Yeah, it's been good. All right, we'll see you all in the next one. Bye now.